Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We have reached the final panel for our activity for the plenary discussion, key takeaways, policy recommendations, and next steps. For our moderator, allow me to introduce Executive Director, Pacific Forum, Executive Director Carl Baker. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Okay, I thought I was going to get a reprieve from the lights, but no, we're going to keep them on just to make me feel like I've been in Guantanamo Bay for 2 days with loud music and lights in my eyes. Okay, so this session is the so what session, I suppose, where we discover what it is we talked about for a day, 2 days. If I can make my computer come back alive. All right, so what we're going to do this panel is really talk about key takeaways. What were some of the key issues that we talked about, and what were some of the disagreements that we had? I think there were some, largely with what China thinks, I think, is probably one of the big issues. And then what did we miss? What didn't we talk about? So what are the further considerations that we have that we could build on from this panel? And then finally, what are policy recommendations? I think we've heard some, but certainly it'll be good to collect other ideas on that topic. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with three brief takeaways from three other participants, and then we'll go to you for questions, comments, good ideas, observations. Okay, so let's get started. And first up, we have Rear Admiral Rommel Ong with his perspective on the 2 day.
Thank you, Panel Chair. Philippines is cursed by its geography. Current geopolitical conditions in the Philippines is akin to making the West Philippine Sea the modern-day Thermopylae Pass of the ancient Greece. And our Philippine Navy, Coast Guard, and our fishermen, unfortunately, are your 300 Spartans. We are holding the line not only for the Philippines, but also for like-minded states who shares our values and the belief in the international rules-based order. I'm not a lawyer, diplomat, or a Coast Guardsman, and I always frame the problem in terms of strategic, operational, and tactical construct. My recommendations will be framed as questions rather than recommendations for the body. Question number one. Sorry, let me go back. The neutrality of the Philippines is essential to Beijing for the following reasons: for the effective sea control of the South China Sea, for the effective control of Bashi Channel in case of a Taiwan scenario, and ensuring the sustainment of its potential footprint in the mid-Pacific, such as Solomon Islands. China's coercive action is geared to break the Filipinos' will, set an example for the rest of ASEAN, and also to promote the idea that the United States is not a reliable ally. As I said earlier, I will frame my recommendations in terms of questions. Question number one: is ASEAN Coast Guard Forum willing to be a norm-setting institution, organization in the future? And in the future, will its agenda consider the fisheries militia as pirate vessels, thus paving the way for counter-piracy operations in the South China Sea? Question number two: the Philippine Navy earlier on in 2016 decided that the operational center of gravity of Chinese maritime forces in the South China Sea is the PLA Navy surface fleet. Its solution was asymmetric, Thus, we decided to acquire the BrahMos anti-ship missile system. Question number 2, is India willing to engage in a BrahMos diplomacy by convincing, or at least making it easier for the rest of Southeast Asian states surrounding South China Sea to acquire the BrahMos anti-ship missile system? Question number 3. One of the tactical dilemmas that faced the Philippines was the swarming tactics of fishery vessels in collaboration with PLA Navy in Chinese Coast Guard vessels. Our solution that was before us was to look at drone technology. But we're not looking for drones alone. We want a drone factory to ensure that there is sufficient supply chain to address the requirements for attritable systems in case of conflict. Militia vessels now may be performing pseudo fishery activities, but in times of conflict, they are well designed to become, in mine warfare doctrine, a craft of opportunity. Question number 4. Is Japan, Australia, Korea, Canada, and France willing to sit down with the Philippines and work towards a parallel maritime security regime to complement the existing hub and spoke system? Question number 5. In the light of the US destruction in the Middle East and in Europe, is Australia, Japan, and India willing to discuss the idea of a network spheres of cooperation, with India taking care of the Indian Ocean, Japan, East Asia, and Australia, the Mid-Pacific? Question number 6. Is the United States willing to lend its Typhoon missile systems for extended period to the United States, to the Philippines, so that the Philippines will be able to break China's escalation dominance in the region? For these types of activities and adversities, I like to guess, I will second guess the mindset of our fisher folks that are deployed in the Scarborough Shoal and confronted by the Chinese Coast Guard and militia on a 24/7 basis. And I believe that when you ask them what will be the message they want to convey to Beijing or to Xi Jinping, I think they will use the words of wisdom of an American icon in the 1980s by the name of Clint Eastwood. And he would say, "Make my day." Thank you.
Thank you. And next on the list is Beck Straight, and let's see what her takeaways are. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It is a real pleasure to be here, and I just want to start by thanking the organisers and telling them how much I respect the mission of this conference, and particularly the directives that we try to remain jargon-free and accessible and translate our knowledge for a broader audience than what perhaps we are used to. So what I would like to do is go back to the central concept of rule of law, because that has been the framing device for this conference, and it is one that is its own specific sort of concept or discourse that I think it is useful to unpack as we think about what we've learnt over the last 2 days and what we can take into the future. So if we go back to some basic principles of rule of law, the first sort of thing that I take away from this is that rule of law means that we are all subject to the law. And this was a point that was raised by several participants, that there is no such thing as being external in this sense. We are all subject to the law. Nobody is above. And this is related to the concept of equality. Now, in domestic jurisdiction, that means that all citizens are equal under the law. In international law, it means states have equality, and this is associated with a second principle, that all subjects are subject to the same laws. And so this is, a basic principle of rule of law that is also associated with a third principle of constitutionalism. This idea that there is, you know, a framework that is able to set out the parameters for what law is, and in international law, what we're talking about here, it's clear that UNCLOS is the constitution for the oceans that we are talking about. And of course, we also need to factor in the fact that there are national laws, national constitutions that are also at play when we think about governance and maritime security. So the United Nations sets out some other principles that we need to think about. Things like procedural and legal transparency, that's certainly been an important part of what we've been talking about today. Accountability, laws being equally and fairly enforced, which is perhaps, well, definitely easier in a domestic context than an international context. Laws need to be independently adjudicated, rulings respected, and there needs to be a sense of legal certainty. So when we think about rule of law, and certainly what I've taken away from the last 2 days, is that rule of law is only part of the problem that we are looking at here. There is also the fact that we have to consider multiple sets of laws. The first panel on the Coast Guards really made that clear, and Alessio's comments in the last panel highlighted that. That we're talking about national jurisdictions and international law. There's also the issue of how rules are interpreted. It's not necessarily that states are deliberately, acting outside of the rules. It's that they interpret those rules differently. There is also the use of deliberate ambiguity, strategic ambiguity that was raised in terms of what does the 9-dash line mean, and this sort of deliberate ambiguity undermines legal clarity that we associate with rule of law. And it is also about the ways in which one state in particular appears to prioritise its domestic laws in the South China Sea ahead of international law, and we can describe this as a form of lawfare or a form of exceptionalism. So when we think about rule of law, part of the tricky thing is balancing the domestic and the international in that. The second point that I wanted to make, or takeaway, that I found quite significant is the role of strategic narratives and political communication in all of this. So dialogues like this are a vehicle for strategic communication. So there's a real usefulness and utility in understanding different perspectives. Certainly, we see very different narratives on the question of who is doing the destabilising. That one was, quite pronounced, as is often the case. But part of the challenge moving forward is how we can stop talking past each other. That to me was something that came through quite strongly on some of the panels, is that there's not a lot of overlapping of these narratives. And so how do we actually get to a point where we're not just understanding that states have different viewpoints, but we're able to move towards some sort of harmonisation about what we're talking about, particularly in specific issue areas. What do we mean by use of force in a maritime context, for example? I think that's one area where we can kind of come together to try to understand what are the limits on state actors when it comes to using force in the maritime domain. So I think that we can all understand and agree that dialogues are important and significant, but there is this real question of why do these strategic narratives matter? And I think the answer to that is, for some political actors, they're about muddying the waters. They're about obscuring truth. They're about providing some very vague justifications for legitimising claims and behaviour. And this is a kind of fake news environment that I think we are seeing much more of with the use of AI and mis and disinformation. And part of it is about undermining objective reality. The third point that I would make, I've got 1 minute to go, is really about where do we go from here? What did we miss? And I think part of what was really interesting to me is that we didn't really focus a lot on non-traditional security challenges like ecosystems, environmentalism, fisheries, blue economy, and those sorts of issues in this particular dialogue. So I think that part of developing a shared vocabulary, as Alessio put it on the last panel, is thinking through how these security challenges are complex and interlinked. We only have to look at things like IUU fishing to know that it's not just a strategic issue, it is an environmental issue. It's a sustainability issue, economic issue. It's an issue to do with human security, particularly if we think about things like slavery at sea. So I think in sort of future iterations, it would be really useful to continue to have this focus on the main sovereign and territorial disputes, but to think about how they intersect with these other non-conventional security challenges as well. Thank you.
And finally, John Bradford with his takeaways.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you, everyone. I'm the last speaker, so I appreciate that you're all hanging in here with me. I have a few minutes, and I'd like to cover a few things. First of all, it's my privilege to join this panel, and I want to congratulate the entire team that came together for this event. The National Security Council, the Philippine Coast Guard, the Philippine Information Agency, the Presidential Communications Office, you've all done a wonderful job, and thank you very much. My own organization, the Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies, YCAPS, really appreciates the opportunity to work together with esteemed organizations such as KS, the PAC Forum, and the Asia Maritime Institute to be an international supporting partner of this important dialogue. I thought today I'd focus my comments on a matter of strategic transparency in the South China Sea and the alternate strategies being involved. Not to take away anything, but I can't come up with a better list of questions than the one Ambassador Ong has already provided. And I think the charting of places for conversations and dialogues like this that Beck has offered is equally illuminating. But several speakers, I would include National Security Advisor Ano, Ambassador Hartman, Admiral Gavan, Commodore Tarea, Director Ray Powell, have all noted that the Philippine strategy of proactive, measured transparency, my label for it, not theirs, has had a game-changing effect. Personally, I think this is largely true. If I were to go back, many people reference, oh, I've been doing the South China Sea conferences for 20 years or 30 years. Myself only since 2004, so I just made my 20-year mark. This is probably the thing which has changed the most, going back to maybe the island building conversations. And I think it's important, and I think there's a lot of variation in the room, so I would like to explore it a little bit more. I think it's undoubtable that, to borrow Ray Powell's phrase, exposing facts shines light on the gray zone. Facts enable observers to make their own decisions and understand what's really going on. Videos and photos explain exactly what is happening in a way that press releases and media briefings cannot. These have the power to cement unified government action, muster international support, and they sharpen soft power in a way that only being morally correct can sharpen power. I think that if you remember the ambassadors panel, they really came back to this in a variety of ways. They talked about the unification of the Filipino people and how the Philippines' strong stance of shining light on issues has mustered the international community. I also think that this Manila dialogue is a fine example of this strategic transparency. As I mentioned earlier, Philippine leadership is responsible for getting us here to offer a very frank, open, and transparent conversation. While the allies and partners who largely see the issues similar to the way the Philippines sees it have been heavily represented, but we also have top-notch Chinese thought leaders here. And they've worked hard to explain their views and on positions and pitch their cases. So I just want to thank Professor Hu, Captain Liu, Hubo's over there, sorry, and Professor Lei for joining the panel. And those of you that were not on panels, thank you as well. I believe we've all benefited from these discussions. I know I have. But let me come back to this issue of strategic transparency. It seems to me that the Philippines transparency strategy has been essential to allowing the Philippines and China to reach the provisional agreement allowing safe passage to the Second Thomas Shoal. Had it not been for that strategy, I don't think we would have made it. But there's downsides to the strategy as well. And this may be why some countries have shied away from taking similar approaches. In the opening comments made on behalf of President Marcos, we heard that the incidents that led up to that agreement inflicted millions of dollars of damage to Philippine Coast Guard vessels. We also know that Philippine Coast Guardsmen were severely injured. To paraphrase Assistant Director General Malaya, it took the loss of a finger to create the opportunity for some limited safety. And that's important to recognize. And I think that's why other countries may take slightly different approaches. It can be a very powerful tool, but it can also escalate tensions. It can create political narratives that push national leaders towards courses of action that they may not have otherwise picked, and it may sometimes distract from higher priority bilateral issues. The great powers, in this case I mean the US and China, have shown themselves to be restrained in publicizing activities on a day-to-day basis. They're quick to highlight grievances, but they tend to want to balance the operational security of their forces with day-to-day publication of what's happening on the water and in the skies above those waters. But in both cases, we have organizations focused on transparency. Those include AMTI and the South China Sea Probing Institute. Again, both leaders are here, and I thank them for their views. The Southeast Asian claimants tend to do something a little bit different. Of these, I would suggest that Vietnam probably has the most complex relationship with China and the strongest unity of action between its government and media arms. When egregious incidents such as the 29 September events where 40 PRC Maritime Safety Administration officers boarded Vietnamese fishing boats, used metal rods to injure the crew members, we learned this first from the Vietnamese media, and shortly thereafter, the international media was able to conduct interviews and collaborate the stories. But at other times, we know less about what's happening in the waters around Vietnam. This is as part of their strategy to manage the relationship with their best frenemy, their neighbor to the north. The other Southeast Asian claimants are probably even more selective in their information release, despite their relatively free medias. Thanks to the work of groups like AMTI, Sealight, South China Sea Probing Institute, we know that PRC vessels are persistently present in the EEZs claimed by these other nations, and very, very frequently in close proximity to region's fishing boats and key vessels such as petroleum survey vessels. Rumors persist that these problematic incidents are regular incidents. The irregular incidents persist, but we get few reports on what's actually happened. So it's hard to know what's actually happened. Thomas Daniel mentioned that the Malaysian government actively shared information about the incidents in 2016 and 2017, but has become more restrained. What this means is, I'll illustrate, and sorry to call you out, Bapak Admiral Eka, but he got a lot of questions on day one, both in his panel and over meals. And when we ask about the questions, the incidents that happened in the North Natuna Sea just after the inauguration of President Prabowo, the questions were things like, what was the strategic intent of China? What was the strategic intent of Jakarta? But it was also sort of more basic questions, like, does this happen all the time? If it does happen all the time, why are we hearing about it today? Is it because the media chose to report it? Is it because Bakamla chose to publicize it? Is it, or as Greg Poling asked, is it a change of strategy in Jakarta? If we had transparent information on a day-to-day basis, the questions would be very different. This creates its own set of challenges. So in conclusion, I think that the questions revolving around which transparency issues and strategies to adopt is probably the most important conversation I took away from today. The Philippines has set out an example of a very proactive, strong case on one side. Other countries might want to look at that and choose what to adopt or what to set aside. These are questions which are ripe for academic study, but the actions that need to be taken today. And we have enough information to make preliminary decisions. And I know I went a little over time, but that's the privilege of being the last speaker. I didn't delay anybody else, so thank you very much. Over to you, Carl.
Thank you. Okay, the floor is now open to other folks who had observations or takeaways or suggestions for policy recommendations. I see a couple coming up. I think I'll let you put your placards up for a minute while I give my 2 cents here. You know, I think that one of the things that I found interesting is that what we talked about was the South China Sea, but we never really talked about the interests of the various actors in the way that I would have expected. And by that, what I mean is the people who were here, and I'll say it, that when we had our ambassadors here, if you noticed, all the ambassadors were not from ASEAN, with the exception of the hosts. And we had the external ambassadors here from the from Europe and from the United States, Australia, and Japan. And we didn't have any ASEAN ambassadors here. And I think that that's maybe reflects what we really talked about in the 2 days, and that is the user states' rights and responsibilities in the South China Sea, and not so much the coastal states' rights and responsibilities in the South China Sea. And I think that's a reflection, and I think it's also reflected that we didn't really talk about those kinds of issues, about the environmental issues, about the fishing, about counter-piracy and all that. So I think that that's another whole aspect of the South China Sea. If we're going to have a real South China Sea discussion, that's a big part of it, where the coastal states have to talk about what's been done with some of the UN programs that have sort of gone away, like PEMC and COBC. You know, those were big initiatives that talked a lot about environmental preservation and about maritime zones and all that. And that's a part that we didn't talk about for the 2 days, I think. And I think that's worth noting, that it certainly is something that should be incorporated and integrated into any future sessions that we talk about that aspect of the South China Sea. Okay, with that, I'll stop. And Beck, Tron?
Thank you, Chair. So related to John's comment earlier about that it's good to have the Chinese speakers here to share their views. So I wonder whether, after understanding the Chinese view and then the South Asian view, can we find some common ground, some middle ground to do something? For example, I know that the Chinese are very skeptical of, legal processes because you think that it's unfair and political, but is there any way we can address that concern? Thanks.
You, Sean?
Thank you, Chair, for noting the absence of the coastal states representation. I think that is very important. I just want to emphasize on what the panelist has mentioned on objective reality. So the notion of military intentions or strategic intention is very important when understanding other nations' behaviors. So there is, I think from the morning's discussion from the ambassadors and also from the claimant states, it's very clear that no one wants an escalation into war. And from China's perspective, from my own perspective of what China thinks, China has not fought a war since 1979. That's the objective reality of reflecting what is China's military or strategic intention even though we don't have measures to indicators to empirically measure one state's military or strategic intention. But I think that is a very clear indicator of what China's strategic or military intention is no war. It has no intention to go to war, and China has been very constrained in terms of cautiously managing the disputes, not to escalate into warfare. And I think to end, my comment is I think communication and is crucial for us to reach consensus. It is not only just crucial for China to understand what others think about, but also the others need to understand China. This is important for us to reach a mutual consensus on how we can resolve the crisis and disputes peacefully. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I think the comment made earlier to you regarding ideas that China could help that communications process is by giving us a definition of the 9-dash line, giving us what the relationship is between the 9-dash line and the 4 shaws. What is their intention? What is your intention there? I think that those kinds of communications would be helpful, because I think that would help people understand what it is China really is pursuing. I agree that it isn't necessarily pursuing war, but what is its pursuit? Is its pursuit complete control of the South China Sea? Then that's problematic for other people, I think. Mr. Paul?
Yeah, thanks. Just so for everyone's consideration, when Sea Light was in its exploratory phases in late 2022, one of the early conclusions we came to, well, first of all, I mean, one of the early conclusions we came to was that gray zone operations succeed because the zone is gray, right? So if if a state actor or even a non-state actor is able to obscure its actions and hide its actions and pay no cost for its actions, it is more likely to take those actions. And so one of the other conclusions we came to was that governments are really, really bad about putting out information. And the Philippines Assertive Transparency campaign is actually the exception that proves the rule. You know, the fact that this has been so remarkable is that the Philippines has been doing something that is so completely unusual, right? And it's very hard. I mean, I worked for a government for 35 years. I know we're terrible, right? It's the government bureaucracy will always do the most, generally do the most conservative thing, which is to hold information, not to put it out, because putting it out is fraught. It's it's weighty. You have to decide. You have to go through all of the downsides, and so it's just it even Jen Parker talked about this in terms of Australia putting out information. So this is to have a government to put it out is kind of new and it's unique, and it's definitely worth a lot more study as far as what the Philippines has been able to accomplish. But I go back to Greg Poling and AMTI and their work back 10 years ago in exposing the island building campaign. And of course, Greg was one of our first interviews as we were trying to decide what to do, because I was in Hanoi at the time. And to some degree, the fact that AMTI was out there doing that, it was because, what made it so remarkable was because, of course, others were not reporting this. So I guess my recommendation is let 100 flowers bloom, right? Let's see more AMTIs and Sea Lights and things like this. By the way, in case anybody's sitting on a large bag of money anywhere, Sea Light is almost entirely unfunded and run by volunteers. So, imagine what could be done with the application just of a little bit of funding. And I'm not here begging for, well, okay, yeah, I'm begging for money. No, but really, I mean, I think that there needs to be more of this. There should be, let's remove from these governments the political and the difficulty in having to make these decisions, get it out there through independent sources, and then they can react to it. And so as we consider next steps, let's consider what kind of funding might and what kind of support might go to independent organizations that are focused simply on the maritime transparency mission? Thank you.
Yeah, if I can follow on with that just a bit, I think that information sharing and transparency go hand in hand, and that's something of a broader issue that I think could be discussed further. But I also point out that Admiral Chalman, who was sitting next to you earlier, brought it up that maybe transparency has unintended consequences. That it's a strategic messaging tool that maybe sends wrong messages to some people and right messages to other people. And it certainly is something that I think is worth looking into, because the basis for what I'm saying is the Philippines has taken a very bold stance by doing the strategic transparency, while as we heard, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia have taken a different tack, and they don't seem to be as much in the spotlight from China as the Philippines. So as the Philippines become the sacrificial lamb here by taking on this transparency role without real support from some of its ASEAN neighbors. I think that's an open question that would be interesting to explore further. Yeah, Ms. Kanahara?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Atsuko Kanehara. This is the last panel of the two-day dialogue. So please allow me to ask a very controversial question. It would be inappropriate for me to do this as an expert of international law, but I cannot resist it. If one state persistently and seriously violates international law, for instance, UNCLOS, should we still adhere to the international law? Until when? I'm afraid that someday we might need to think this seriously. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to follow Ray's comments on the role of the independent group in the maritime transparency. So it's actually very nice to see Dr. Hai today make transparent to the threats in the South China Sea and the threats to Vietnam. And yesterday, Ambassador Lai Taiping also opened to the idea of the maritime transparency. Actually, the South China Sea Chronicle Initiative is the very first independent group in Vietnam, and it has promoted maritime transparency for nearly 10 years without causing any chaos in the society. I believe that my colleague here, Wu Haidang or Hai, also agree with that. And also our report has been cited by a well-known platform like Sea-Line or MTI or other international reports. So I'm not sure if this is a question, or I'd like to make a policy recommendation specifically to Vietnam government that I'm wondering if Vietnam is a time for Vietnam government should allow the independent group within the country that participated as a capable and supportive group, as a capable and supportive force to help maintain the peace and rules-based order in the South China Sea. Yeah, thank you very much.
Who?
Thank you, Chair. I just share my personal feeling to participate in this kind of dialogue. You know that it seems that China is in the recent years. It seems that everything related to China is a big news. Otherwise, nobody cares. So, China is a big country. Yes, China should have more responsibility to safeguard the regional peace and stability. But also, China is a sovereign state. So for me, I say that China has been treated unfairly in diplomatically and the media coverage. So as to transparency, I think that China should be more transparency, and other stakeholders, including other claimants, should also do that. And China should be focused on, but also other actors should also be focused and be more transparency. Thanks.
Ms. Lee?
Thank you, Chair. So I have one question addressed to Dr. Strotting, and it's also a follow-up from Professor Yi. So you mentioned about the importance of promoting dialogue and strategic communication, and I do agree with that. It's a part of building trust. But when there is some information that is confidential to the state, like climate state, there is no accountability, there's no transparency. How can we build trust in this kind of situation? And another is discussion, is a dilemma discussions to all the panelists. So currently there's no agreement, or like inside ASEAN there's no unity on South China Sea. But in case in the future, if let's say Cambodia or Laos switch side, or we have a different front policy, or if there's unity within ASEAN, do we perceive as a threat to China? Thank you.
Apologies to both Carl and Jeff. I thought I was going to go through the first time I've ever gone to a conference this long and not actually weighed in. I thought I was going to go the whole 2 days without saying anything. 3 points, if I may. First, as a former lawyer, it seems to me we're talking a whole lot about rights, and yet legal rights come with legal responsibilities. And one way of, I think, addressing some of these issues would be spending a little more time addressing what are the responsibilities of the states involved and the actors. And that might leaven some of the disputes. Of course, that's contingent upon those conversations be taken seriously, which brings me to my second point. The young leaders met before this conference began, and we were trying to tease out what we would anticipate some of the key themes were. And one person at this table, who will go unnamed because it was Chatham House rule, said, to wrap it up, the key question about surrounding this conversation is, what does China want? And the way you answer that question will very much tell you what you think of these issues. And I think that's been revealed very plainly in some of this conversation. The Chinese insist to us and make very clear their peaceful history, their good intentions. And yet, as the Chinese inform the Americans in the conversations that we have, intentions change. For some reason, that doesn't apply in my meetings and the conversations with our friends from China and elsewhere. And if, Professor Hu, you feel picked upon, welcome to great power status. That's the way the world works. And partly that is because, as a great power, you have greater responsibilities than other countries do. And we hear China speaking more about its rights than we do its responsibilities. And I think that we need to, one of the issues that invariably comes, one of the key points I'm going to make in a second, is that the United States, in its, whatever you think of its hypocrisies and its behavior, has always, or at least in the post-war era, taken those responsibilities and the need to provide public goods quite seriously. And that is very much reflected in the role that the U.S. has played in this region, precisely because it has assumed that need to provide public goods, for self-interest, of course, but it has also met the needs of other nations. And I think that China needs to internalize that logic a little bit more. And the gap between the intentions that you profess and behavior that others see creates a tension that we experience in this conversation and other conversations like it. And you may not like that, but it nevertheless is, and you need to address it. Wait, I'm not quite done yet. But in a sec, wait, let me just, if I may, seriously. The third point, though, and I'm sorry to drag on. so much of this conversation is a function of the fact that this behavior is seen through a very particular prism, which is that of the US-China geopolitical competition. And the truth of the matter is, I think that some of the questions that I was asking in earlier panels were, are there ways to talk about external forces in ways that sidestep that particular bilateral competition? And I was trying to get other folks to address whether there were other actors that we could engage in ways that would diminish that particular tension, and I was relatively unsuccessful. But I want to suggest, as some of, I think is clear, that competition will both sharpen and will change significantly, I think, in the months and years ahead, given political developments in several of the countries, not just in my own. And we need to be thinking about ways to shift the perspective away from this bilateral geopolitical competition to a different context. And that will help us address, and I would just mention that because if in fact this is merely the inaugural meeting, I think you need to be taking up that shifting perspective in subsequent iterations of this dialogue and discussion. Sorry for rabbiting on.
Okay, thanks. I thought that was a great round of comments. I'm going to respond in three groups. So first, I want to kind of tie together the questions and comments by Dr. Bertrand, Ray Powell, and Dr. Pham. So specifically to Vic's question, is there a common ground? Is there a solution? I'm going to save that answer to when I put in my submission for the Nobel Prize. I figured it out today, but I don't want to let any of you know so that you don't get the prize. Jokes aside, no. I don't think we've discovered new common ground. But the reason I tie this in with the points that Mr. Powell and Dr. Pham made is I do think there's a major innovation at foot that goes beyond strategic transparency. I talked about in my final comments. I think that is the rise of small independent organizations that are fostering solutions, whether that be Sealight by displaying all of the tracks, all of the activities, not just selecting one country or another, whether that be Dr. Pham, who's mining vernacular language and sharing that with the global community so that the media coverage and other knowledge is not siloed in independent countries, or groups like my own YCAPS or Beck's Blue Security, which are focused very much on professional development. I don't think these are going to solve things, but they're all a path to make things better. And I think that's important, and I hope that you can all join in supporting it. And that dovetails directly with just one point I want to respond to my friend, Professor Hubo. You urged that China should be more transparent. I agree. I would like South China Sea Probing Initiative to join the groups I just talked about. Please, when you tweet every day about which aircraft carrier is where and which reconnaissance flight is where, please also show us where the Chinese ships are and the Chinese flights, because you know it, but you're selective, right? And I don't think it's helpful. I'm glad. I think the world is better off with you than without you, but you could do more. So I appreciate that we have a common view. To Ms. Yi, I actually think that this is your question is very illustrative of the perception gaps, right? So your question boiled down to China has not fought a war since it attacked Vietnam in 1979. So who is the warmonger? Well, look around the region at another view. If I'm wearing batik, if I'm sitting in Jakarta, I can say, well, the other South China Sea claimants have not fought a war in the post-colonial period. They haven't fought wars for much longer than since China attacked Vietnam. Philippines has never fought a war as a post-colonial state. Malaysia, Brunei, never fought a war as a post-colonial state. Arguably, Indonesia fought a war until 1963, but it was a war of independence. So if you want to really cast aspersions on Indonesia as a warmonger, you can say, well, they fought a very justified war that ended 16 years before China's last war. And this isn't for me to say, oh, China's a warmonger. That's not my position. But something that China can feel very confident makes them the good guy doesn't necessarily make them look like the good guy in the region. And those perception gaps is why I go back to this point of education and transparency and discussions. That's why I think it's important. And that's why in my comments I highlighted how important it was that you were here and we could hear from you. And finally to Ms. Kanehara, thank you very much. You ask a controversial question and I have a controversial answer. I do understand your point, but at the same time, the answer I think is pretty simple. We do need to follow international law. Without it, what else do we have? Just because a small number of states, or in your assertion, one state, is persistently not following it, doesn't mean we throw the baby out with the bathwater. So, Beck, maybe, or?
Mr. Levy? Sorry.
Oh, is that okay? Thank you. Well, thank you for all of those comments and questions. Just wanting to add a couple of things to what John has just said. Big understanding different views, I think, is really critical, and that's why it's so good to be a part of this dialogue. It's just that, as I mentioned in my comments, I think we're still talking past each other, and there might be specific issues where we can develop some sort of harmonisation or some sort of common understanding. But it's hard not to think that there is a deliberate strategy of strategic ambiguity here. That part of the problem is that we don't really know what is being claimed by something like the 9-dash line. And that creates problems for legal clarity, which, as I mentioned in my comments, the United Nations says is an important component of rule of law. So while there is, I think trying to get greater transparency around what China means by that would be quite helpful, and I would really hope to see that. The other point, thank you, Yi, for your comments about no one wanting escalation, and that China has not had this identity as a warmonger. I mean, all I would say to that is my understanding of grey zone activities are that they are precisely designed to avoid war because they want to pressure other states to capitulate. So those two things can coexist. So I think there was another question about building trust, and absolutely agree with you, strategic communication is important, and there are times when states need to keep things secret. No question there. I think I would go back though to the issue that I raised about strategic ambiguity, because there are times when states can be clearer and more transparent, and I think that's what this dialogue is really designed to be about, is not necessarily saying that all states have to be transparent all the time, but what are the areas where states could do better to make their claims more, or to articulate what they mean, to create that sense of clarity that really underpins the concept of rule of law as we've been talking about it over the past 2 days. Ray, I have no money, so I am very happy to support your more money for transparency, and I hope you find it somewhere. And the final point that I would like to make, and Kanehara-san's point about UNCLOS, I mean, smaller and middle power states played a really important part in negotiating the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And I don't think that we should forget that that is a product of their agency. And it goes back to one of the themes here throughout the last 2 days, is that we cannot be looking at these issues merely through the lens of US-China competition, but we need to respect that it was a remarkable convention in a lot of ways. I don't think we could make that kind of convention today, given the sort of the structural realities. And so I'd pose a question to you in response is, how can we imagine a maritime order without UNCLOS? And I don't think it's one that a lot of states want to grapple with or deal with it, because UNCLOS is what gives Philippines its rights to its EZ. Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and so on. So I know, Ray, when you were truth bombing yesterday, I think you said something about these conversations about UNCLOS as being a bit passé, but it is what underpins the rights, entitlements of states in the region. So I'll end my comments just by a sort of full-throated endorsement of maintaining UNCLOS.
Okay, Ms. Levy.
Thank you very much, Chair. Pete Levy from Australia again. Just noting the topic of this particular session with the recommendations, I've got 2 comments and a recommendation that I've drawn over the last day or so. The 2 comments, I guess, one draws on Professor Yee's comments at the start of this session about China wanting peaceful resolution of the issues that we're talking about. And it strikes me that that's exactly what the Philippines tried to do, using the only peaceful mechanisms that we have, which is international law. And I think it's difficult for that to progress satisfactorily when one side of the dispute both refuses to be part of that proceeding and then it refuses to accept the outcome when it is handed down in 2016. So I think that's a challenge. That's an first observation. The second one is the discussion around transparency. And I guess I'm reminded, and some of our American friends might be able to help me here, but it strikes me that during the Cold War, the USSR and the United States reached a position where there was effectively, they allowed each other a greater degree of spying on each other effectively than what you might have expected. Things like overflight of areas. They knew there was satellite monitoring of particularly nuclear weapons, nuclear inspections and the like. So there was a lot of transparency, I think, or my sense is, but between the US and the USSR, that level of mutual trust, I guess, is not present where we are today. Now that China's displaced the Soviet Union as the other superpower in the world. And the recommendation that I would make is perhaps a little bit more of a focus for future iterations on what's actually happening on the water. There was a lot of discussion in most panels, and particularly in the diplomatic panel, the ambassadors panel just before lunch, about the significant progress that's been made, and it's really positive, on the political and diplomatic side, and certainly on the transparency side. And they're very, very welcome, they're very real, and they're very important. But to me, real progress happens when we see behavioural change on the water. And what we've seen in the last 12 months is actually not progress in that dimension. In fact, we've probably gone backwards. We've seen greater violence. We've seen a Philippine Coast Guard sailor lose a thumb. And we've discussed before about the water cannons and the like. Whilst one half of that equation, the diplomatic political side, and that is really, really important, there's a lot of positive sides there, and we did discuss a little bit about what's happening on water, but I think in the future iterations of the Manila dialogue, a greater focus on the on-water behaviour and how that's developing and changing, I think would be valuable, because ultimately that's what we're trying to achieve. Thank you very much.
Are you back in?
Yeah, I want to clarify again. Dash 9 is not China's maritime claims in the South China Sea. Dash 9 is not, 9-9 is not the claims of South China Sea, Chinese claims in the South China Sea. Actually, the Dash 9 just mark the scope of China's maritime claims inside the waters. So I have mentioned this morning in the panelist, and I think I would like to repeat it again, that China's maritime claims doesn't generated by the Dash 9s. The Dash 9 just marks the scope of the different maritime claims inside. So if you can also read the China's claims in the China's Foreign Ministry's website. It's very, very clear. 4 categories of maritime claims. That's as to the. So if I can have some contributions, I think if I have some help to clarify that, I think that will be good for me. And second, as to the transparency, sometimes, my feeling is that nowadays when people are scholars, especially these diplomats, are talking about the South China Sea issue, I think the position decides everything. Every party just based on their own position to explain, no matter what kind of truth and fact. So the contributions of transparency is that if we based on the same technology and the same methodology, just as SSPI, sometimes we have the same conclusion with AMTI. So we should have the same conclusion. But nowadays, because we are influenced by the position, by the related party, by their own claims and position too much. So we couldn't see the situation objectively. That's a pity. Thanks.
Mr. Ho? No?
So actually, my question complete a bit complicated. It goes to the chair and go to Professor Huibo. So could you please clarify the limits of China claim in the South China Sea? Is there any way that we can know the limits of that, or otherwise, it could be 70%, 80%, or 90%. So it change according to Chinese mood. Is that possible, right?
Did you understand the question?
The four categories of maritime claims, I think the foreshore sovereignty, and secondly is internal water and territorial sea of four island groups, and the third one is EEZ and continental shelf. Finally is historical rights. So yes, my personal understanding not clear enough, but is so. As to the current situation, I think is clear enough. But I think China should contribute more on to clarify. But historical rights has been established a long time before the signature of the UNCLOS. So it is a historical reason. Also, there are some other reasons because as to the development of rule of law. So, but we can communicate and have dialogue on that. But we shouldn't exaggerate China's claims on as to the destiny. Okay, China draws a destiny and claims everything inside. That's a fake news. I think many major mainstream medias cover the story like this. Okay, China claims everything inside the destiny, but the truth is not that. Only the sovereignty is very, very rarely just against the waters of the four islands group. So we may have different ideas, but we can communicate, but you shouldn't misunderstand China's maritime claims and exaggerate the claims. Thanks.
Okay, I think that's probably enough on that topic. I think it does reflect the need for more clarification, better understanding of what people's claims are in the South China Sea, and how UNCLOS plays into those claims. I think that it's pretty simple, and to say that everybody has their own claims, yes, they do, but it also at some point has to come back to the role of UNCLOS as the fundamental basis for making decisions about territorial claims. And so we go round and round about how different you can interpret the rules, but I think it's a useful conversation to have based on international law, which in this case is UNCLOS. Which leads me to a broader point about future opportunities for discussion. I think is to talk a little bit more about the code of conduct. I mean, one of the takeaways I had from the 2 days of discussions is that nobody really has any confidence in the code of conduct. Yet we're still talking about the code of conduct, and ASEAN says we're getting close. I mean, if you listen to the new ASEAN chair, we're going to get it resolved this year. And this has been the case for, I think, the last 3 ASEAN chairs, that they were going to get it resolved. But there doesn't really seem to be enough political will to do that. And so I think that's probably a discussion that would be an interesting follow-on, to talk about if we're not satisfied with the code of conduct, what is it that we're not satisfied with, and is there any way to move past the code of conduct to something more effective? So I think that's just another topic that we could explore further. Okay, well, with that, I don't see any other plaque. Oh, who has a placard up? Oh, sorry. Yep, Greg, go ahead.
Hey, Ralph. Well, as we think of future fora like these, I mean, I guess the point I would make that I think was illuminated by like 4 of the last 5 interjections is that when it comes to discussing the legal issues, what's increasingly valuable is discussions around intra-ASEAN efforts, process of delimitation, where continental shelf claims stand, because those things keep evolving, right? We've had Philippines, Malaysia just this year providing greater clarity. We had the Indonesia-Vietnam delimitation. Talking about new efforts in international law like the BBNJ treaty. All of those help clarify for the ASEAN claimants and external parties where there are paths for management, de-escalation, etc. What is not useful, I think, is discussing the 9-dash line anymore. To borrow a phrase from former President Bill Clinton, it's like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. China's claim will simply change if it is proven wrong in any way. Historic rights did not exist until the 90s. Intertemporal law did not exist until 2014. The idea of offshore archipelagos did not exist until 2017. And there will be some new interpretation of the claim. Because what is different between China and the other claimants is not the details of the claim, it's a philosophy about international law. For everybody else, international law is a thing that applies to all states equally. For China, it is a tool of power to be used or discarded or amended as necessary. And so, you've been doing more of these than I have, but I've been doing them for 12 or 13 years now, and I think every one of us could close our eyes and give the speech that we would hear. And it's not the fault of Huobo or Liu Xiaobo. It's, this is just what it is. And we keep running on this wheel. I think it would be far more interesting to kind of check in once in a while. What's the current claim? Got it. And then move on.
Point taken. I think you're right, Greg. Johannes.
Thank you very much. I think, regarding about the code of conduct, I think deep down everybody knows that it is just, it isn't nothing burger. I think you will soon finding pigs flies first before we got the code of conduct. The reason is because, let me ask you, what's the alternative? For every single ASEAN countries here, what's the alternative for code of conduct? Because the alternative is either more confrontation, more war, and every single ASEAN countries, I think, is practically does not want any more confrontation. It is not that we want to choose United States or we want to choose China. You others from other ASEAN countries, you can correct me if you want, but what I know is that most ASEAN countries just don't care, don't want to be dragged into great power rivalry. We don't like China. We hate China. But because of the 9-dash line. Get rid of the stupid 9-dash line and ASEAN will be your best friend. But the same thing, that does not mean that we want to go directly to United States. Because why? Because we also don't trust United States. Not that I don't like United States. I love United States, but But most people just don't like it. Because why? Because they look at the record, they look at what happened for the past, I don't know, I mean, like in Indonesia, I mean, we were United States best friend for like, since like 1967 when we killed all the commie, and then until 1990s, and then suddenly, bam, Bill Clinton just put an embargo on us because of East Timor. So nobody trusts United States that much. So United States also have a trust problem. But that is, so what's the alternative? Well, I mean, so that's why we have to just keep talking and talking and talking until the cows come home about the code of conduct. Because we just want to postpone the inevitable. I mean, because once we got into conflict with China, that's when we are getting dragged into great power war between the United States and China. And most of the countries in Southeast Asia does not want it. I mean, that's plain and simple.
Well, then why don't you?
Why don't we what?
Why don't you just stop talking about code of conduct and
Well,
say
I mean,
we're not going to do it?
Well, what's the alternative? I mean, that's the question. I mean, I asked this to every single diplomat I know. I mean, from Malaysia, Singapore, and whatever, and they say, yeah, there's no alternative. That's why we keep talking. And I said, that's bullshit. Well, that's bullshit.
Okay, well, that's not probably a very fruitful conversation to continue. It's clearly the end of the day. We've grown cynical. And so I think we're going to wrap it up, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeffrey to do some final comments.
Yeah, no, there's no additional comments. Just want to thank everyone for your participation, the National Security Council, the Philippine Coast Guard, the West Philippine Sea Transparency Office, Daniela Brown, who I can't see now, but Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Philippines has been really supportive of this effort. Also Pacific Forum and its Young Leaders Program. I think the Young Leaders Program brought about 15 or 16 young leaders to this dialogue, so thank you very much. This was obviously not a perfect Track 1.5 dialogue. This is our first, so many lessons learned in terms of ensuring more productive discussions next time. And also, I think for next year, we have established a new organization here in the Philippines to coordinate all efforts, the We Protect Our Seas, WPS, which is going to coordinate all efforts and link all the organizations interested in continuing this effort. And also, I'm happy to announce that we are going to have a second iteration around November 2025. We will try to socialize the agenda with government offices here in the Philippines and around the region to make sure that the 2025 iteration is as responsive as possible to the issues that matter. So, of course, thank you to Commodore J. Tariela for all the assistance, the logistical support, all the support that essentially made this dialogue possible. So thank you very much, and see you next year.
And one final comment here, and that is everyone needs to thank Jeffrey for all the hard work that he put in to do this.
On that note, that concludes the Manila Dialogue in the South China Sea. To everyone, congratulations and have a safe flight to your homes.